wherever you want, here or here. So, are you speaking from the?
I don't need the PowerPoint, but yeah, I will go there.
It's up to you. Good afternoon. Kalispera. So we will continue. We're a little late, and there are some changes in the program. In our section today, we will not have the presentation that is S45, Climate Change and Human Domination of Nature, a Philosophical Approach. This will be presented tomorrow, but we still have 4 presentations, 2 keynote speeches, and then two other presentations. So I will try to keep the time and see if we can finish by little before 7 o'clock. So we are moving. We are all more than an hour late, but we will try to see what we can do and how we can catch up. So without further introduction, it is my pleasure and my honor to present Professor Nadia Furlan from Slovenia, who will be speaking on ecological racism, ecological injustice, a call for a giant women's interreligious action. Nadia, you have the floor.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Since Guillermo has delivered us these tasty Swiss chocolates, he had the care. He has taken care of our pheromones. So I hope we are all relaxed now. Today I would just like to make a few thoughts or points about the ecological racism. Precisely, I would like to actually put forward one challenge for faith communities and also for secular spaces to address, and that is actually the ecological injustice in terms of ecological racism, and also the fact that women are disproportionately affected by climate change, but are often left out of decision-making on the issue. So this especially affects predominantly poor women of color and their reproductive health. Because of air pollution, reduction of access to clean water, and increasing exposure to toxic chemicals, women worldwide suffer the consequences of climate change more profoundly. Their vulnerability to the effects of climate change gives women the unique experience and knowledge enabling them or us to make a significant contribution to efforts to improve climate resilience, sustainability, and the change of attitudes of major world religions, and consequently the change of consciousness and our attitudes toward the environmental issues and ecological crisis. So first, I would like to briefly draw the line between so-called global climate change. We usually address climate change to be a global problem. There's nothing wrong about it. What I want to draw attention to is the misuse of globalism or global climate change issues with so-called the ethics of interrelatedness or interconnectedness, which seems also to be the core of the ecofeminist ethics, also the Christian ecofeminist ethics. Globalization does actually not cover many problems and becomes a convenient answer to the question when we do not know or do not want to solve the very specific problems we face on local levels. So that brings me to the concept of social and ecological injustice or justice. Peter have spoken about social justice in our previous session, and I will somehow try to pick it from there. We all know that the question and perception of social justice in so-called Western cultures is strongly influenced by the Greek philosophical and also biblical traditions. However, despite the focus of social justice on the concept of human rights and equal opportunities, the understanding of social justice in today's Western societies is very diverse. In the narrower sense, and I think that that is what, Peter, you referred to today before, social justice is contained in the legal systems, norms, regulations, rules, and codes of the social system and its jurisprudence. The importance of social justice, however, encompasses and reflects deeper values and expressions. It goes beyond mere formalistic legal and regulatory systems. It encompasses and expresses the principles of fair trade, action, social and societal equality, equal recognition, equal opportunity for every human being. It also encompasses the relationship between human beings and nature or non-human beings. So in this context, social justice is the signifier and determinant that regulates the dynamics of the entire network of relationships, interpersonal, between humanity and nature, and the public sphere, the political, economic structures, etc., etc. It is an expression of the organization of the whole society, an expression of the structures of the distribution and division of power, of material wealth, of privilege, duties, and rights of every dimension of social interaction or integration. So examples of social injustice can thus be seen in the unequal distribution of wealth, while the modern world drowns in abundance in some parts of the world. In others, it does not even have the essential survival needs. In the exclusive rule of superior, economically more powerful nations and institutions, elites, in the systematic use of the national military apparatus, in economically poor countries to silence disagreements and suppress civil initiatives and attempts at liberation and transformation movements, forced evictions, the resettlement of indigenous peoples, and the exploitation, devastation, and destruction of their ancestral lands and sacred spaces by mining and forestry lobbies, denial and violation of workers' rights, oppression, discrimination, violence, and abuse of women and children, lack of safe drinking water, lack of basic hygiene and access to health care and education, etc., etc. Now, theological ecofeminisms critically question the attitude of the human imperialistic and consumeristic relationship towards animals, plants, environment, and nature. Ecofeminism sets the mirror of social injustice or justice and connects sexual or gender injustice with ecological injustice. Social and ecological responsibility in this way go hand in hand. The basic understanding is that we are all interconnected at the interface of various systemic and institutional discriminations, be it racism, xenophobia, sexism, homophobia. It is therefore a feminist perspective based on the assumption that oppression of women and abuse of nature are related phenomena, neglected and subordinated by violent, imperialistic, patriarchal, global, consumeristic view. So the concept of ecological justice is necessarily linked to the concept of interdependence. We could say also to the spiritual unity and the networking of all ecosystems and living beings. Now, we could have just a closer look to the definition of eco-justice and environmental justice defined by United States Environmental Protection Agency as, the quote, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies, end of quote. This definition has been criticized by environmental justice advocates for its lack of emphasis on the historical burden of environmental hazards on marginalized groups and its lack of acknowledgement of social justice and political empowerment as central goals of the environmental justice movement. However, it captures two important central ideas of environmental justice, that is, the equal distribution of environmental burdens and benefits across all people, and the equal and fair involvement of all groups in environmental decision-making. Now, traditionally, racial discrimination has been the central issue around which environmental justice has originated. More recently, however, other forms of discrimination, such as class-based and gender-based discrimination, have started to receive attention as well. Environmental justice is realized by the fair and equitable distribution of environmental burdens across the entire population, as well as the ensuring of equitable access to and involvement in the mechanisms used to address environmental issues. Now, I would just like to quickly draw your attention on the research that Katie Weiss, an Australian ecofeminist, has actually done about women's health in the northern part of Australia and the impact of climate change on it. And this marvelous research that he has done has shown that women actually are disproportionately affected by environmental problems. And there are, as she states, three main reasons for this. The social construction of womanhood, women's longer life expectancy, and women's poverty. So the interaction of these factors with forms of discrimination such as sexism, racism, and ageism result in social conditions that put women at risk of environmental injustice. Despite the clear link between gender and experience of climate change, a gendered perspective is largely absent from environmental research, policy planning, and implementation. Now, since I already mentioned that climate change is felt differently across race, gender, class, and income levels. For this reason, solutions to climate change must use an intersectional approach that prioritize and integrates the voices of advocates from other social justice platforms. Now, I would like to remind us also that also Pope Francis has actually talked about the so-called environmental injustice, or the cases in his encyclica Laudato Si. He points out to a close relationship between the poor and the vulnerability of the planet, and in the pollution and decay of the human and natural environment. He actually sees the symptoms of social decline, the quiet rupture of bonds, and the collapse of the social community. And he agrees with the opinion of His Excellency Ecumenical Patriarch Bartolomeo that crime against nature is crime against ourselves and sin against gods, and demands the urgent need for a change in human selves. Now, in the I found it to be really interesting what he has wrote down in the preface of the book, of his understanding of social justice, he actually invites us to change this sick world, as he has put down. The hope that we can do this, perhaps the most precious virtue perhaps the most precious virtue of our time, writes Francis in an introduction to the book of the Italian journalist Michel Zucchini, Potere del denaro, la giustizia sociale secondo Bergoglio. Now I would like to conclude briefly. Now the time we live in focus us to fundamentally consider and transform the sentiment of negative understandings and discriminatory practices of so-called written or also unwritten written moral codes of, I have put down monotheistic religions, but religions as such. Because religion should be ethical and moral per se. The notion of righteousness, Hebrew mishpat, is a key biblical notion that reaches deepest among all basic elements of biblical theological concepts. Knowing God, therefore, means right action. The semantic analysis of the concept of righteousness is thus the message of the Lord revealing himself as the Savior of all humankind. The concept of righteousness is often synonymous with the concept of salvation, which in Old Testament is manifested primarily in Yahweh's interventions in historical events. The New Testament, however, focuses on the person of Jesus Christ and his voluntary gestures of self-sacrifice on the cross and subsequent salvation. Thus, the concept of righteousness, together with the notion of salvation, most characterizes the Christian theocentric positions of biblical revelation about the world and humanity. So in this context, the biblical concept of justice is closely linked to righteousness. This biblical code of justice has faded in the light of exclusionary, I would say, sharply power-centered theologies. The power in a negative way, like power over, right, to conquer somebody or someone. Like the respect and recognition of the principle of gender equality and the equal recognition of women's voices is crucial step of also towards ecological justice. Although the voices of women and their engagement in interreligious dialogue and the religious establishment of peace, at least on visible formal levels, is often left out, it is at informal levels, in the expression of concrete actions, the women's effort to restore peace is very much alive and present. So it should be noted, however, that the issue of equal gender recognition or sexual recognition or recognition of women and their visible role at formal levels as well is in fact very closely connected with the question of understanding and positioning of the religious other. Therefore, the key to the equal recognition of women's voices is one of the key components of quality interreligious dialogue, or the key to equal recognition of the religious other. Both are crucial in transforming and raising human awareness of on the individual as well as in collective levels, and are important mirrors of the eco-justice or social justice achieved in society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadia. We have very little time, but I will open the floor if there are some questions or comments to Nadia on her presentation. If there are no comments and questions, we will pass immediately to the next speaker. Thank you. Thank you. So, yes, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so how is the situation in Slovakia for... Slovenia. Oh, I thought it was... Oh, Slovakia. Oh, sorry. So what is the situation in Slovenia for women?
Thank you. Regarding women and climate change and their action?
Yes.
Well, I wouldn't say there are a few initiatives. Okay, there are a few initiatives that actually came, and you might find that strange, from Muslim communities, which is actually really small in Slovenia. But they have started actually the women peace-building action agenda towards climate change. And they have addressed this in one small conference. It was national conference. So they have started to actually join their voices within interfaith women's interreligious dialogue. That was 2 years ago. Despite of that, just there are lots of things going on within NGOs, but within different interfaith communities, unfortunately not.
Thank you.
Thank you for the update from Hungary. So we will pass to the next speaker, and it is my honor to give the floor to Dr. Seyed Masood Nouri, who has been in other ECOTHEE, so it's known for those of us who have participated. I think this will be a different voice in our conference, but very constructive and as part of this dialogue dimension of the academy. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello everyone, and it's my honor to talk to you in this afternoon. Of course, I need to start by saying thank you for Lucas. When I was preparing myself to send an abstract, I was thinking about the necessity of defense of climate change defenses. So, okay, it's good, okay. Because I received a lot of bad reports about what big companies and some authoritarian regimes did against journalists who try to arise awareness of people about what they do against the climate change. But my friend and my colleagues, Professor Philip Alston, the UN special reporter and head of center that I was working there, Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU Law School, exactly 3 months ago in his recent report to the UN General Assembly, Council of Human Rights, he used a new term, climate apartheid. And I see that this term is a good umbrella, a good cover for a lot of my ideas, general ideas, and send an email to Lucas and send him, can I talk about this? He said yes, of course. And we asked Professor Alston to explain and address to our conference a record around 20 minutes, explain why these terms comes to his mind and what is his interpretation of that. And it is available, and maybe we can see it and listen to him in conference or after that. So, but I'm going to talk about climate apartheid based on my understanding. Every of us know that apartheid can refer, of course, you know that about any terms we have some difference definition from different perspective, but generally speaking, we can say that systematic and strong discrimination against some people. maybe some of based on their race or their colors or something like that. But climate apartheid refer to situation that we divide people as a discrimination situation based on what they can against the threat of comes from global warming and climate change. Let me give you a very simple and clear example. Some years ago, when New York was surrounded by a big storm, all city become dark. The electricity is cut. But a few long buildings have electricity. Main building belong to big bank, and some very, very expensive neighborhood have this facility. If you see that the city, you see that there is two kind of people. One group can protect themselves against against climate change, and the majority of people cannot. So this is a very, very simple example. And we see these differences between rich country and poor country or developing country, and in the country between different group of people. So based on interpretation of Professor Alston, he said that the impacts of global heating are likely to undermine not only basic rights of life, water, food, and housing for 100 millions of people, but also democracy and the rule of law. So this kind of apartheid has bad impact on the democracy and rule of law as well. So I talk about the major threats or big problem for our human society. All of them, I talk about 5 of them, and all 4, and all these 4 is related to climate apartheid. One of them is the rise of populist regimes. No need to explain after what last election in the United States, and after that we have this kind of government in Brazil, in India, in some part of Europe, and even some right party for first time get some seat in the parliament in Europe and other countries. So this kind of governments, because they don't have a real solution for the problem, they want to use shortcuts, but there is no shortcut. And look at the United States. The people who works in the companies against climate, against environmental issues, themselves become the responsible of this office in the government. And they cut all budgets, research budget about this problem. And the president says that this is a story, this is not real things. And what happened against in Brazil, and what happened in Russia, what happened in the jungles. The government of Russia says that because there is no people over there and there is no factory, it is not necessary to pay money to stop this phenomena. And the same explanation we have from the Brazilian government. So the populist regimes has a very, very bad deal with the climate change and don't support the defender of this era. The second problem is that misuse of new technology. New technology, of course, all of us use them and use the benefits, but they can be tools against environmental. For example, look at the advertisement for shopping, 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 buying, buying, buying. So when big companies encourage people to have more shopping, it means that they use more resource and is against climate interest. And third things about the nuclear, I don't like to use the word war, but it is against become a real threat. Look at what happened in Pakistan and India, in the Kashmir. And before that, the President Trump come out from the deal with Russia in nuclear weapons. And after that, we heard recently from President of Turkey that the countries have this kind of weapon are not in position to say the other countries you shouldn't have. Is related to Israel. I do not want to say that President Recep Tayyip Erdogan wants to start this kind of plan, but it is a bad sign. And the government of Saudi Arabia says that if we become sure that Iran wants to have this nuclear weapon, we start our plan. So it's a kind of threat again, and it is clear that if any kind of nuclear test or war happen, what happened for the climate. The fourth is terrorism. Everybody and every government think and do some action against terrorism. But I do believe that based on what happened in reality, about terrorism, we have some kind of exaggeration. Look, the people was killed by overeating more than people killed by terrorist activists. The people around the world, the number of people which killed by car accident is more than people killed by terrorist activists. But because of some reasons, governments don't like to talk about, for example, car accident, because it is their responsibility to do something, and they don't want or cannot do something about that. So they usually say nothing about this big problem, but they focus on terrorism. And the last, and I think one of the most important threat is climate apartheid. So what we can do as a solution, because there is not enough time, I can talk about some solution, but I'm not talking about a technology solution because it's not my expertise, and I'm going to talk about social and legal solution to deal with the climate apartheid. The first one is ensure the safety of environmental activists. Usually I'm talking about the journalists. Based on reports from the NGOs which take care about the journalists, we have some journalists that killed or received threat around the world, in Africa, in India, in even some part of Europe, but in Europe not by government, but by big companies. And we need to think about them, because they are talking about the reality and give people the information. If they don't have enough safety, they cannot do their work good. The second is having more active and creative education system. I'm not familiar with the whole education system in different countries, but in some of Middle East countries that I have studied about that, the educational system is for the past, useful for the past, even not for the current situation, rather than the future. So it is necessary to bring this issue, climate change and climate apartheid, to formal education from school, para-school to university, and non-formal education through programs like street law, which tries to teach law to ordinary people, to public people, and some initiative in universities like clinical legal education program to increase public awareness, because if people understand that there is no shortcut, there is no short way, they don't give their vote to populist government, populist party. And NGOs and religious leaders can they have a very important role, but the problem is that they themselves don't have enough knowledge. And because of that, I'm talking and have some suggestions to bring some religious leader from different religion, different part of world, because they talk to people. For example, in Muslim society, every Friday, they talk to people, and people participate in their sermon as their religious duties. So a Muslim said that this is necessary for me, based on my religious understanding, to participate in Friday prayer. And Imam has time to give 2 short sermons. But they didn't talk about some issue like climate change, because they don't enough information. So it is our duty to let them know about it. And the other thing is the global solidarity. We have this term, self-determinations. Based on these terms, which is one of the human rights, basic human rights, every government says that, like what President Trump says, America is first. So they believe that, these politicians believe that we should care about our national interest. Yes, this is their duties, but with open-minded interpretation. It is not support the national interest if we have a plan to resolve to a big problem, to climate, to environment, because it's not for the next generation. And we should understand that the human being as a big family, and especially environment is not recognized the border. So what happened in, for example, Turkey, it has bad or good result in Syria and in Iraq and indirectly in Iran. So it's not just about them. The jungle of Amazon is not about the Brazilian government or Brazilian people. So is globally thinking and locally practice, I think, is one of the most important solution. And the last thing about the legal solution. Look, if a government, a regime, start committing genocide or pass the border and comes to another country, start a war, we have in international law almost not enough but at least we have some kind of sanction. Or even a country wants to start testing nuclear weapon. UN and maybe another other international bodies have something to do that. We have enough, not enough, but some reaction. But if a government don't care about what happened in the country about environmental, nobody says nothing to him. For example, right now in what happened in for Amazon jungle, okay? Legally, nobody can say thing to Brazilian government because they say that it is my country and it is my decision and the parliament and I am a president of this country, so it is my responsibility and my right. I do believe that right now we are in the steps that we should change this policy. We cannot close our eyes what happened inside of border of country. So we need a legal action against governments that don't care about environmental issues. I know that it is very, very difficult process, long process, but unfortunately we have enough time and we should start. And as Professor Arslan says to the representative of government, there is no time anymore that you gather together in Geneva or in New York and say something and that's it. It's not enough. So at least we should talk about that. We should say that we need real and strong way to deal with this kind of government. Thank you so much, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. When I read the two titles, I didn't see any link, but after listening to both of them, I think both of them were addressing issues of justice. Nadia very clearly addressing social justice, the women's injustice, how to deal with this, and Sayed addressing this new concept that is emerging about climate apartheid, and how actions should be at different levels that I would call from this justice perspective, both at the social level with education plans, awareness raising and so on, but also being aware, being able to have a legal system that responds to the challenges. No, we know that especially in relationship to international environmental law, we're very weak, and the conventions or protocols that we have, like the Kyoto Protocol, that was the binding instrument of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it was not at all followed by those who committed to reduce their CO2 emissions. So how to address this issue. So thank you very much. We have some minutes for your questions and comments before asking the other two presenters to come here. The floor is yours. Yes, please, Martin.
At the beginning of your speech, you focused on the governments who emphasize terrorism more than car accidents. My question, I understand the point. My question is, can you just compare these two issues?
To compare about the number of people suffered by this situation, the number of people killed or suffered by terrorist actions, we have the number of that, and we have the number of people that killing by overeating, killing by car accident. There are more, but we don't care about that. We don't talk about that. But we focus on this. I don't like to say that terrorism is not important thing. I want to say that sometimes, for example, if I have a newspaper and the first and the main title of my newspaper is that the scientist says that this about the climate change. This is a real threat. Another newspaper says that 5 people killed in a bombing, for example, in Geneva. The people, anywhere, sorry, in New York. So the people read this newspaper, and it is so important, and don't pay attention about that. This is my point. I don't like to say it's not important, but a limited number, even in the very, very bad, look at what happened in 9/11. The number of people that killed, we don't have the number. And the number that killed by those two other situations. Yeah.
Yes, Marek.
Mm-hmm. I know that there are many, many court cases right now around the world. They can be against oil companies or against states or whatever. But is there, do you know whether there is already some work being done on what you just mentioned, so that there is international framework for indicting, let's say, English states, governments?
About the apartheid climate, no, because this is a new notion.
Yeah, but the legal, I know that there are young environmental jurists, legal persons, who are working in this field. Do you know anything about these developments?
The development was happened and are happened right now, but slow, so slow, too slowly. Why? Because the government, the powerful companies don't like and want to stop. And the court in a lot of countries, indeed not independent. If a government don't like to support this idea, it is very, very difficult to the court have make a decision against that. But we need to awareness, public awareness. This is the main argument.
If I may add, at least in the United States, there is the Center for International Environmental Law that's dealing with this. There is Earth Justice. And one of the examples of this at the international level is the discussion that's being held on the possibility of having a convention on climate refugees. As you know, the notion of refugee is defined by the Geneva Conventions, is limited to a certain number of issues, political issues, religious, ideology, etc. And environment is not part of it. But there is a work that's being done, Vienna, the Netherlands, Canada, and so on, trying to see whether at the international level there could be either a convention, either a protocol to the UNFCCC. So there are a lot of developments going on. But as he rightly said, I believe that international environmental law is still not well accepted by all, as it is international humanitarian law, international human rights law. No? So there are developments, but it's not something very, very strong.
And a result of what you say, some NGOs in south of Italy have researched, because a lot of people come from Africa to Italy, from Libya to, they say that we living at the area with armed conflict. Why they say that? Because they know that if they say that, the convention support them. But there is not reality. They are moving because of there is no enough water to their living. So they understand that the number of immigrant for the climate is increased slowly, but there is no legal system to support them.
We need to move. Yeah, Araki. Yeah.
Very briefly, this I know. I mean, that they're trying to get a framework for climate refugees. But that's not United States. But I mean, I'm looking out for some kind of framework, or I don't know how, that internationally lawyer or prosecutors can say to U.S. President Trump, for example, listen.
No, there is no way.
There's no.
Yeah. Why? Because in international law, there is no super person. The government themselves make a convention. So it is related to people to vote to a person that support this idea. They agree with Paris Agreement, not come out. So this again comes to our public affairs.
We need to close this time, and we thank again
so much.
both of the speakers. Thank you. And I'm calling now Dr. Larrabee. Thank you. And Dr. Vordubas. Yes, please. We will start with Dr. Larrabee.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry. Yeah, it's okay.
So you have 10, maximum 15 minutes.
Okay, we'll do the best. I was told 20. I was told 20.
So I apologize, but we have very limited time, so he will have the time for only 10, 15 minutes to do this. And well.
All right. Good afternoon. So I am a scientist and a theologian, and since I'm talking to a bunch of theologians, I'm going to put on my science hat. Friday I was at the climate strike in New York City, and Greta asked us to listen to the scientists. Well, the scientific message couldn't be clearer. If we want to limit the temperature to 2 degrees Celsius, it requires emitting less than about 1,000 gigatons of carbon. About 656 of that have already been emitted. That leaves 344 to be divided between countries. The voluntary reductions from Paris would result in an average temperature rise of 3 degrees C or more. So rather than talking about voluntary contributions, we need to start talking about required ethical reductions, which is what I'm going to be talking about. So the United States has emitted more carbon from 1959 to the present than any other single country. Those who have created the problem have the responsibility to correct the problem. And any additional use by the developed world limits other countries' ability to utilize fossil fuels in their development if we are to stay within that 1,000 degrees. We've got 3 basic issues. How do we transition the world to zero emissions of carbon quickly? How do we build the infrastructure needed for sustainable development and adaptation, which is going to require energy, 80% of which is now generated by fossil fuels? And we are almost out of time, so how are the less developed countries going to be able to develop for sustainability and adaptation in very little time? So this paper addresses the ethical division of the remaining CO2 emissions among countries. Or to put it in another light from some of your papers, where is the greed line for the country's share of the remaining CO2 emissions? Now I'm going to use a tool called the Lorenz slide. Okay, I missed it. Lorenz Curve. So let me start off by explaining what I'm going to be showing you. We take the countries of the world, and this is sort of a hypothetical 3 world countries. I'll do it for all of them in a minute. And we sort them by list of their CO2 emissions per capita. So in this case, it's India, China, United States, low to high. We add the populations, and we create what's called the cumulative populations. So, let's see, do I have an arrow here? No. So, I'm going to talk away. Hopefully you can hear me. So the cumulative population at the India level, the first country, is just its population. Cumulative population in China is you add India's, and China's together to get the 2,749 in this hypothetical world. And finally, the United States, you add that to the total, and this becomes, the result becomes the total population within the countries that you're using. And then you use the total CO2 emissions for the country. We either have it or we multiply the population, and we do the same thing for the cumulative emissions. So India, in this hypothetical example, is the first country with just its total emissions. China adds their emissions to India, and the United States adds their emissions to India, China, and so on. So this number becomes the total emissions in the entire group. I'm going to be using tons of carbon. Other people use tons of carbon, CO2. You want to change, just multiply my numbers by 44 divided by 12, and you'll get the CO2 numbers. Okay. So to look at the Lorenz curve, we plot up the total cumulative population versus the total emissions. If the emissions were done equally, you would get that dashed line. The actual curve you here is for, I think it's 214 countries. This is for 2018. And this area between this line and this curve represents the global inequality. If you, in economics, you're familiar with this for income and wealth distribution. It's been used for CO2 since about 1997 as well. I'm going to come back to the slide in a second. We computed a numerical coefficient for the inequality by taking this area between the red and the Lorenz curve, which is the total inequality, and divide it by this area plus the area B underneath the curve. We get something called the Gini coefficient, which is a numerical measure of inequality. So, in this Lorenz curve, the Gini coefficient is about 0.5, which is generally, if it was income, would be a high degree of inequality. The U.S. currently runs it all this other way. I've shown the three countries, and the one thing I want to point out is the slope of the arrow for India and China versus the slope of the line. If the slope of the arrow is greater than the line, you're emitting more than average per capita. And if it's less than the line, you're emitting less than average per capita. So you can look at this and say, the U.S. is way more than average, China is a bit more than average, and India is quite a bit below average. Now, we can use this to look at various strategies for dividing up the CO2 emissions. So, very briefly, 1,000 gigatons was the limit for 2 degrees C, roughly. 656 has been used. Future land use change, if we could solve that problem in 50 years, the result about 50 gigatons. If the bunker stocks of fuel used for international transport, if we can solve that in the next 50 years, that could be limited to 12. That totals 717, which means you've got 283 left to divide among the countries of the planet. Total, that's it. Go more than that, you're above 2 degrees C, roughly. So, rather than do what the IPCC does is look at possible political scenarios, we're going to look at curves that meet the requirement and see what happens when you actually try to meet them. So this red line, this is historical data. This red line represents the kind of curve you would need to meet 2 degrees C. The green line, 3 degrees C. The purple line, 4 degrees C. So what we're going to do is we're going to advance the countries using the United Nations population reports and the CO2 data we get from the global carbon budget from 2018. We're going to advance them along various strategies along this curve to see what happens to the inequality. Am I doing okay? Sideways? I hope. Okay. So the ones, what?
Half of the percentage.
Okay. So the strategy is talked about a lot, especially for the U.S., called the grandfather strategy. That is, you develop a baseline, and every country in the world develops a baseline, and then everybody reduces their emissions from that baseline by the same percentage. But if you do that to follow that 2 degree C curve, you get a sequence of Lorenz curves the following. So the projected 2019 would be the black line here, which is my baseline. This would be 2015, the bottom line. These are 5-year increments. The purple line would be 2100. Now, if you notice, way, that's because the population is growing, which takes the terminal point and moves it out. The top line moves down because the emissions are in fact being reduced. The curvature remains the same. I'll show you a plot later of what happens to the Gini coefficient, but the inequality is growing in this scenario. So let's try another scenario. Let's assume that rather than doing grandfather, we put a cap on the emissions per capita. Okay, so we say we're going to lower this cap slowly, and every country is going to have to be underneath the cap. In our Lorenz curve, this is the same of, say, A is a new desired point. If you draw a line from A to this curve, tangent to it, then that's the same as creating emissions cap, like the slope of this. Okay? And we can project this and move it down and see what happens to the curve. So this is the sequence of Lorenz plots again from that strategy to 1000. And you can see before the curvature was maintained, now you see this going flat. Of course, the endpoints are the same, moving out, population and down, but the curve is flattening out. The Gini coefficient is lower. In the previous plot, 100% of the countries were reducing their emissions. In this plot, less than 100%. Again, I'll show you a little bit more. Let me talk briefly about a third strategy, which is a little bit different. Rather than putting emissions a cap, I'm sorry, there's the number of countries that are involved in the emissions cap. So you can see in 2050, I think we have 137 countries that are on that year that are undergoing some type of emissions cap. And they're the higher emitting countries. Another strategy, I'm calling it high emitters first, says you start with the highest emitters and you bring them down to an emissions cap and you go down until you've satisfied your budget. Everybody else is at the same level. So you start at the high and you work down. Graphically, if A is the point you want in your new curve, everyone between A and B has to reduce their emissions. Everybody else stays at 300%. And you can show by construction that this involves even fewer countries. And that's the high emitters' first set of Lorenz curves for this. They look much the same, but you'll notice that the countries are scrambled a bit now. That's because when the cap occurs, the country may find itself no longer in the same orientation as this. So let's compare some of the results of what this would imply. So the emissions per capita cap is a blue line. You can see the high emitters first involves even fewer countries in any given year. This is the Gini coefficient for the three. The black at the top line is for the grandfather clause. And you can see that if you adopted that this year, that the Gini coefficient keeps rising. And the emissions get worse. The other two, in fact, had it falling to a much more equal distribution, roughly the same. So there's an ethical issue right here with the grandfather clause. It's great for the developed countries. Now, if I take the profile, have the profiles when we run this run for every country in the database, presenting all of them, and I can total all the emissions the country would have between 2020 and year 2100. That's their share of the pie under each of these strategies. And I'll just skip to a couple of them. I use Qatar because somebody here was from Qatar. They have a really high emissions per capita. And you can see they're hit amazingly hard. The USA, the grandfather versus the some kind of emissions cap, their total emissions is cut in half. China, a little bit of a reduction. India grows by a factor of 2. Okay? We're here at Greece. Greece is roughly the same at all. Peru is an example of a country that has much more freedom under the emissions cap and has a higher level of emissions to develop sustainable development goals. And I did a talk where we were doing some comparisons. I used DR Congo, so I have that. DR Congo, sustainable development goals, typical middle of Africa, And you see just a phenomenal difference in what's available to them.
2 minutes.
Okay. Pretty good. So this is an example of what happens when we look at comparison countries. So under the high emission, the LAC profile, the top curve, this is the tons of carbon per person per year. You'll see what would have to happen to the U.S. emissions. U.S. is currently reducing its emissions per capita, and it really would have to drop off the map. And it drops until it hits roughly China's. And then China gets hit by the emissions cap, and they drop together until they hit India's emissions. Meanwhile, India's growing a little bit, China's growing a little bit. And they drop together. The red line here is DR Congo. And I'll just put that up briefly. They're not affected to 2083. Okay. So the emissions cap and the high emissions first cap make room for the less developed countries to give them space to grow, lowers the Gini coefficient, reduces the inequality. And I'll end before comments with this. This is the projected Lorenz plot, the high emission thing in 2050. And you can see the area is much stronger. The area is much less reduced, and you can see that the U.S., China, India have almost the same slope curve. This is what it looks like under the grandfathering clause. Oh, I'm sorry. That's what it looks like under the grandfathering clause. And you can see the positions are the same, the curve has grown, inequality has grown, etc. The sign from the climate march. So let me conclude by making the following. The U.S. and China actually probably is pursuing a strategy for grandfathering clause. And that forces the countries with lower emissions per capita to pursue reductions prematurely, thereby impacting the ability of the LDCs to achieve sustainable development goals on a timely basis. I'll note in passing that both the Human Development Index and GNP are both at the low end, are both related to energy use. If somebody's interested, I can show you a plot, but if you prematurely cut the energy use, you endanger the human development index of the rest of all countries, for sure. The use of the emissions cap, per capita cap, or the high emissions first strategies as a guiding ethical principle does make sense and gives preference to the poor. And we can compare the nationally determined contributions in terms of the Paris costs that we're having now to those what's left in the budget as a means of comparison. And I would hope that the ethical community and the church would start doing those kinds of comparisons and say, in the U.S., for instance, you're probably a factor of 4 or 5 too high. So it's a strategy for comparison.
Thank you very much. Very little time for questions or comments. Yes?
My question might sound a bit odd at first, but still. I know, what about the carbon emissions from so-called aviation industry,
yes,
airplanes? I know that it is hard to...
I
mean, it's a tricky... I wonder myself, whom to put, the carbon emission,
yeah, I don't have it here. So that's bunker stocks. Bunker stocks are the fuel used for the ships and airplanes in international travel. I'm assuming that we get that that goes to zero in the next 50 years.
But
If it doesn't,
on what presumption? Because the transportation within the airplane transportations are actually rising up. I mean,
yes. So in the projections, that's what I've assumed for the bunker stocks. So at the current, they are rising up. We're about here. So this would be a rising for about 10 years in the normal historical trends. phasing them out with renewable type machinery, it would take about 25 years to replace them.
Last question to this.
Have you tried to combine this with the idea of social justice? I mean, we have this discussion in our country about production, not only emissions, but also production. Who's gaining money from this emission production scenario?
So there are a couple of researchers that have attempted to do a consumption-based CO2. They've done it for a number of years. The two peer-reviewed journals I've looked at, they come to slightly different results. We really don't have good data for it, but what I can tell you, at least from the US case, is that we are a net importer of CO2, a strong net importer. So to repeat the question, when you buy a product that's made in China, and that product generated CO2 in the atmosphere, who gets, if you would, billed for the CO2? Currently it's China. So it would be nice to be able to bill it to the consumer. One of the arguments on the tax on oil that has all its other problems is that then you identify it by the source.
To follow up, it's not only a question about the consumer, it's also a question about the production of the oil and gas.
Right.
Because I'm living in a country which is mainly based on exporting oil and gas.
So I know from some of the numbers, the CO2 numbers for the oil producers includes the flaring chemicals and things like that, which is one of the reasons it often is very high. So some of that's in there. Industrial uses are in there, but again, it's always built from something. So an oil producer produces CO2 in the manufacturing of oil, and then you buy the oil. You use it to produce carbon monoxide. The country that's using it gets billed for the CO2 that they produce, and the oil producing state gets billed for the CO2 involved in the energy.
We need to move. Thank you very much again, Professor Larrabee. And then we have Dr. Voudubas, who will make his presentation, and after this we will have a break. Yes?
So probably it's the last presentation for this session, so I will try to be short.
Thank you so much.
Well, I have followed the last 5 years the efforts of the Orthodoxy Academy of Crete, Dr. Konstantinos Zorbas, Mr. Antonis Kalogerakis, Dr. Lukas Andrianos, to create, to promote local energy communities or cooperatives. Although in Europe they are well developed, in Greece they have been made few efforts so far, and we have only few successful energy communities in our country. So my presentation is going to focus on the contribution of energy communities in the promotion of energy sustainable buildings that are promoted from the European policies and having as a final result the mitigation of climate change. Buildings use large amount of energy and emit large amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It has been estimated that currently the buildings in European community or in European countries consume around 40% of the total energy consumption. The rest is used by industry, in transport, in agriculture, and in other activities. Energy is used in buildings for lighting, the operation of various electric appliances, for air conditions, and the production of domestic hot water. Buildings usually consume fossil fuels, in Greece and in Europe natural gas and diesel oil, and grid electricity, which is usually generated by fossil fuels in the majority of the European countries, in order to cover the energy requirements. This results to greenhouse gases emissions with severe impacts on climate change. In order to reduce the environmental impacts of the buildings, we have to replace fossil fuels with benign energy sources which do not emit greenhouse gases and mainly renewable energy sources. Which renewable energy sources and technologies could be used in buildings for providing electricity, heat and cooling? In Greece at least, and in other European countries, solar thermal energy is used broadly for hot water production, solar photovoltaic energy for electricity generation, solid biomass for space heating and hot water production, district heating systems using low carbon emission fuels like biomass, high efficiency heat pumps for air conditioning, and finally cogeneration systems for electricity and heat generation using low carbon emission fuels. Cogeneration systems are mainly used in large buildings. They are not used in individual residential buildings. These renewable energy sources and technologies are currently mature, they are reliable, you can rely on them, and they are cost effective. So it is not necessary to subsidize them. They are cost effective by themselves. And as you can see, the most of them are can be used for heat generation, either space heating or hot water production. Of course, we can use small wind turbines, but commercially small wind turbines for residential or other buildings are not well developed at the moment. What are the characteristics of renewable energy technologies? Current developments and advances in these technologies can assure to us that they are reliable, they are mature, and they are cost effective. They are used currently for electricity, heat and cooling in various buildings in many daily applications. You can find them in private buildings. Locally in Crete we use very much solar thermal energy for hot water production, solid biomass for space heating, high efficiency heat pumps for air conditioning, and the last 5 years many residential and other buildings are utilizing, hotels for instance, and public buildings like the Orthodox Academy of Crete use solar photovoltaic energy for electricity generation. The European legislation and the Greek legislation currently promotes the use of renewable energy sources in order to increase the energy efficiency of building and to minimize the use of fossil fuels and carbon dioxide emissions. The current EU directives that promote this policy is the Directive 31 that was issued in the year 2010 and the revision of this directive with a number 844 which was issued the last year. These two directives categorize the buildings as and try to promote all the new buildings to be nearly zero energy buildings. That means that they have to reduce significantly the overall energy consumption, as it estimated kilowatt hours per square meter per year. These new type of buildings that are promoted from the European Union and community must be high energy efficient, very efficient in energy consumption. They should have low fossil fuel consumption as well, since the energy consumption the overall is reduced, and they will have low greenhouse gas emissions. This is the target of the European Union in order to increase the security, because most of the fuels are imported currently, and also to mitigate climate change, to achieve the climate change goals. Another type of building that have been studied recently on European level is zero carbon emission building. This zero carbon emission building can be conceived as a building which has replaced all fossil fuel use with renewable energy sources, so it does not utilize fossil fuels, and it does not emit greenhouse gases. But it is connected into the grid, so it uses grid electricity. So this building should generate with non-carbon emitting fuels like solar energy, electricity, which will be sent into the grid and must be equal with its annual energy consumption. This is the rule, and there are some regulations in all European countries, and in Greece, of course, with the regulation of net metering. So how to finance the energy renovation of building in order to achieve the target of nearly zero energy building? The availability of private financial sources is rather limited, particularly in Greece, where the last 10 years we had a severe economic crisis. So the efforts are now to try to motivate private funding from various sources. One source of private funding is to get financing by an ESCO, an energy service company. The creation of ESCO is promoted by the European and Greek policy. So it's legal now to create an ESCO that is a private company who invests in energy saving, in renewable energies, in various private or public organizations, like hospitals. It is called also third-party finance. So it is necessary now to mobilize private funds because we need a large amount of capital to transform all the European building stock because the public funding is not enough. So here comes the role of energy cooperatives and energy community. A cooperative can leverage the strength of the member and it can create a higher effect because if we gather, all of us here, some money, some capital, the total sum has a bigger strength. This is the concept of a cooperative. So with an energy cooperative, the citizens, the members, will gather a large amount of capital and they will be able to invest in various energy projects, either energy saving projects or renewable energy promotion projects. So there is a need now for the creation of energy communities. There is a recent Greek legislation that promotes the creation of energy communities. So, establishment, sorry, I missed one. There are one law of the previous year, the law 4513, concerning the creation and operation in Greece of energy communities. And there is also additional, during this year, a ministerial decision from the Ministry of Environment and Energy, which regards the possibility of virtual net metering of energy community. With the term virtual net metering means that we can construct a photovoltaic plant, not on site of the building that we are going to offset to counterbalance the electricity consumption, but we can construct the photovoltaic off-site of a building. We call this in Greece virtual net metering. The laws, what they say, a minimum number of 5 participants, when they are not public organizations, but just citizens, individuals, must be, this is the minimum number that can establish an energy community. If we are talking about municipal organizations or community organizations, there could be 2 members. The maximum number of shares that each member in the community, in the cooperative, can hold is 20%, only 1/5. And but municipal organizations, they can have a share of 50%. They can have the half of the shares of the energy community. And another term that the Greek legislations wants to be is at least 10% of the annual profits of the community to be used as reserves. So they must keep it as to create capital and not be distributed to the members. Which activities can an energy community in Greece can implement according to the legislation? To generate electricity, heat and cooling from renewable energy sources and low carbon emission energy sources. To produce and distribute heat and cooling in the region of the energy community. To supply electric vehicles for its members. To install water desalination systems with the use of renewable energy sources in the region that the energy community belongs. To provide energy services to various users, to educate and sensitize various users, citizens, members in the municipality for energy sustainability, and to consult its members and to promote and to encourage the participation in national or EU-funded energy projects. These are the main activities that the Greek legislation allow to energy communities to implement. What financial support does the Greek government offer to energy communities at the moment? We now have utilized EU structural funds for the period 2013-2020 that is going to end until, to durate until 2022. Through the EU structural funds, the Greek government tries to subsidize the creation of energy community regarding the investments. So if an energy community wants to invest on a solar photovoltaic plant, the government is going to subsidize the necessary capital. The maximum investment capital that could be subsidized by the government in each community lies between 2,500 euros up to 1 million euros. And the duration of the investments in renewable energy projects for an energy community that can be subsidized is up to 30 months. So the Greek government at the moment tries to promote by capital subsidizing the renewable energy investments or the energy saving investments made by the energy communities. And this money comes from EU structural fund. What happens abroad? In Germany, there are currently 869 citizens energy cooperatives in Germany with 183,000 members, and they have invested around 3 billion euros in renewable energy projects. Most of the renewable energy projects are focused on solar power generation, solar photovoltaic plants, and in less extent in solar thermal plants. Apart from Germany, in England, they are well developed. At the moment, in England, there are 109 to 98 energy cooperatives, and the vision of these cooperatives, as is promoted, is putting people at the heart of the energy system to promote energy democracy. And the mission of these energy cooperatives is to support and accelerate the transition to a fair, low-carbon and community-led energy system. So the experience from the operation of energy cooperatives in many European countries, I don't have time to mention France, Italy and other EU countries, but in Belgium, in Holland, they are also well developed. There is a lot of experience and successful operation so far of energy cooperatives in Europe. And they have contributed quite a lot in the development of renewable energy sources, renewable energy technologies, and in the mitigation of climate change. I think, thank you very much for your attention.
Other questions or comments? Thank you so much for this very concrete. Can you give us some numbers on how are these cooperatives in Greece, in Crete?
So far there are 2 or 3 cooperatives only in Greece which have started and they have, we can say that they have a successful creation. In a small island and also in the region of Thessaly, we have 2 or 3 cooperatives that are trying to move forwards, but there are 2 important points, peculiarities in the Greek state at the moment, in Greece. One is the severe economic crisis, and the other is the bad experience that the citizens had on the failures of many cooperatives, either on agricultural level or in cities. Okay. So there is a bad experience of the Greek citizens regarding the creation, operation of cooperatives, and they are not willing to participate. You must, promote them with various ways.
Thank you. Other questions come? Yes, please. Heiner.
Thank you for an interesting introduction. My question is maybe a little bit on the side, because I was wondering if there are some reflection of the energy use in front of or while the building is going on, while the people are building the building, so to speak. I guess here in Greece you're using concrete and glass and things like that, which is quite energy using compared also with wooden. I think it's a trend globally with these wooden new builds, even if it's of course very important to not use wrong kind of trees. But do you have any reflections of how you can avoid this energy misuse of using too much concrete, for instance?
Well, yes. I will try to answer shortly in this question. When we are talking for energy consumption in a building, we are talking about operating energy consumption, the energy that is consumed in the building during its lifetime, during it operates, and we are talking about embodied energy, the energy that has been consumed during its construction, its maintenance, and its demolition. Unfortunately, in Greece, because of the mild climate that we have, we use very, very poor insulation, thermal insulation, with the result that the total energy consumption of a building in Greece, expressed in kilowatt hours per square meter per year, to be almost equal as in Central or Northern Europe, where they use more, better insulation, thermal insulation. According to the existing studies, energy is consumed in a building, the 60 to 70% of the annual energy used in a building, residential building, is used for space heating. So in northern Greece could be 80%. That means if you have a very poor thermal insulation, you waste too much energy. So one way to improve the energy efficiency of our buildings is to improve the thermal insulation, changing windows. The old buildings had single glazed windows. That is not accepted today. So we try to change the windows to double glazing, to insulate the roof, to make thermal insulation by insulating externally the facades, and also to use local renewable energy sources like solar thermal heaters. But unfortunately, the Greek buildings constructed in the past, before 2010, are very, very poorly insulated. So, first thing, improve the thermal insulation.
Yeah, the last question we're taking because we want to close. Yes, please.
How is the law system in Greece? I mean, in Norway, we changed the construction law last 5 years back because we want to have better standards about energy consumption and connected to that. There's also a question about these. When the temperature is getting higher now, that means that you don't only need to isolate the house, you also need to cool it down.
Well, the first measure that you take is to improve the insulation. If you improve the thermal insulation, you reduce the heating load and the cooling load. That's the first measure that you have to take. The second is that after 2010, the Greek legislation have complied with the European regulations, so the Greek legislation has changed quite a lot. So nowadays, you cannot construct a building as you were constructing it 10, 20 years ago. The rules now are very, very strict, and all the new buildings are required to be very energy efficient with continuous controls. 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the public authorities did not make controls in these buildings when they were under construction. So everybody did whatever he likes, or he liked.
Thank you very much. We're having a short break, and then we will continue. I don't know what. 5 minutes.